Following the release of My Hero Academia's Chapter 311, there has been quite a bit of speculation among fans about the possible status of All Might following the events of this chapter, which see a grenade thrown at his car by an unknown villain. While some say that there's no way that he didn't survive this because that would be an incredibly anticlimactic way for such a beloved central character to die, others are a bit less optimistic and fall into the camp which thinks that he may not survive this. And while I definitely agree that there are compelling reasons to make both arguments, I am going to argue that it's likely that he did not survive the car bombing, and though this is not the outcome that I imagine most other people would want to see play out, it is the one that I believe makes the most narrative sense based on what we've seen so far. And in this video, I will do my best to explain my position and why I believe that that's the most likely outcome based on our current evidence. So, why would I think that? What I believe is more compelling evidence for my theory comes from the panels directly leading up to the one in which All Might's car is hit by a grenade. To contextualize a little bit, on the page before the accident is depicted, All Might is shown worrying about Deku, thinking that he's probably not getting enough sleep due to the fact that he's constantly on the move as he watches his GPS signal. Now, if not for another panel slightly before this, I would not really ascribe much meaning to this in terms of whether he had lived or died. It seems to be just one of those sort of father-son moments that we've seen a lot of since this arc began, and while heartwarming, I would not really ascribe much meaning to it. But its entire meaning changes in light of one specific panel which is shown right in the middle of that sequence, which, at least in my mind, which depicts what is ostensibly a previous exchange between All Might and his former sidekick, Sir Night-Eye. Now, if you're like me, when you hear that name, you immediately think of Night-Eye's prediction back in season 4 of the anime, and I'm not sure what arc of the manga, that All Might would eventually, around the time that the series is taking place, meet a brutal death at the hands of villains. That is what I immediately associate with Sir Night-Eye, and while that might not be how every fan sees him, that's what's going to be brought to mind by his appearance for me. And in this panel, Sir Night-Eye is imploring All Might to get some rest in a real bed, which seems to me like a very, very random thing to bring back at this point, because truthfully, there are any number of scenarios or anecdotes that Horikoshi could have used to illustrate the point that All Might is self-reflecting in light of what he's learning through mentoring Deku. There are many ways that could have been depicted, and yet he chose to use a Night-Eye flashback. Why? What is the significance of that specific character other than being just a person who has cared about All Might in the past? I believe that this panel was supposed to point us back to the fact that All Might is in imminent danger. Because, like I said, my immediate association with Night-Eye is that prediction he made of All Might's death. And I don't see why that specific character would have been used, because remember, every narrative choice is intentional. And if there had been some other character or scenario that was better suited to further the narrative than what was given to us, it would have been used. So naturally, there had to be some reason that Night-Eye was the best choice for the person to both convey that message and be brought to the reader's minds in that panel. And in my mind, the only reason that he would be the most relevant individual to deliver that message in that specific instance was if we were supposed to be reminded that All Might is likely going to die. Thus, I really don't think that the inclusion of Night-Eye there is an accident, especially given that right afterwards, All Might is in an accident that's leading most of the fandom to speculate as to whether he even survived. And ultimately, that is why I believe that even though it would be anticlimactic and certainly would not be the death that most people or I expected, it makes narrative sense for All Might to have died in that accident if Night Eye is being invoked in the previous panels the way that he is. We are supposed to, I believe that either this is a clever fake out or he has actually died, but either way, we are supposed to see that character and be reminded of his prediction and perhaps a bit wary of it going into the panel in which a grenade is thrown at his car, which to me indicates that it's pretty likely that this is shown because the next few panels show that prediction coming to pass. While this is not an airtight theory, I absolutely do not believe that Night Eye's appearance there was an accident, or he just happened to be chosen at a moment that coincidentally correlated with his role in the story thus far so well. But so I could be wrong, and I will say this is not the heroic death that a lot of people would have expected or wanted even. So
because really, if you think about it,
well
this was
could
not
be wrong.
subtle
And like I said,
at
this
all.
could easily
Having
be a
the
red
person
herring.
who
Predicted that All Might would die show up right before he could possibly die. Either seems to be like a very obvious hint that he did die, or a very obvious hint that we're supposed to think he did. It doesn't seem to me like it's likely that it's pointing towards anything else. So, in conclusion, while I certainly hope that he's still alive, as it would be obviously tragic if this were how he were to meet his end, I think that on the whole, this car accident meets the specifications for Night Eye's prediction really well, which only stipulates that he'd die a brutal death at the hands of villains, which I would think, being in a car that blew up, was fairly brutal. It would bring his narrative to a conclusion the way we pretty much all expected, and it would tie in neatly to the way that that scene was written. So while I don't think it's an ideal situation, I think that it's the most, like, this theory presents the most likely explanation of that scene, and I will be interested to see what 312 has to say about this, because it really seems to me like there's some heavy symbolism, which, whether or not I end up being right, and I really hope that I'm not, will be interesting to see play out in the long run.